Welcome to my lecture series on Middle East politics. This is Dr. Bafano with East Tennessee State University. This is going to be lecture 22 in this series. It's part two of a discussion that I started last lecture on the politics of the Arab Gulf monarchies, right? In today's lecture, we're going to specifically focus on how oil has helped these monarchies survive and to sustain their rule in an era in which monarchies really have kind of disappeared in most of the world. So we're going to get to it. Let me first just share my screen with you. All right. So what sits at the heart economically of these regimes in the Arab Gulf? Countries like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Kuwait is that they are highly dependent on oil as an economic resource. It shapes in many ways the nature of these monarchies and how they control their countries. Now, part of what's unique about the Arab Gulf, and we talked about this last lecture a little bit, is that these countries have relatively small populations and enormous oil reserves. In fact, the Arab Gulf has about half of the world's oil reserves approximately. Saudi Arabia has 25% approximately alone of the world's oil reserves, yet their populations are relatively small. And so why is this important? Well, it means that these countries can have a relatively high standard of living without having industrialized, without having invested in innovation, building factories, mass producing goods, without having to really develop high quality educational institutions. With oil revenue, they have been able to increase the standard of living of citizens. And so, thus, they haven't had to invest as much in other areas of development that other countries such as Turkey have had to do in order to develop their economies. And so the way these systems work, part of what's important here as well, since their economies are not diversified, right? So Saudi Arabia, about 90% of its economy is based on oil. Qatar, it's about 70%, and so on and so forth. Because the economy is so much centralized on a single resource, it makes it easy for a ruling family, a dictatorship, to control that source of wealth. And from there, they then can distribute that to their loyal allies in society as a way to sustain their rule, right? So think about it from this perspective. Some of you out there might be living in democracies, or perhaps you desire democracy. Well, how much money would it take for someone to give up your freedom, right? So if someone offered you, say $100,000 a year, maybe 200, maybe a million, would you then decide to give up on having a voice in a political system? Well, we do tend to find that in these kind of rentier economies and these oil dependent economies like Saudi Arabia, because a high standard of living is sustained, this tends to satisfy citizens. So these ruling families, they use wealth and redistribute it in a way that keeps them in control. Now, of course, within these economies, it's oil it's oil that is the source of wealth. And this type of resource is what is known as a rent. Now, when you think of a rent, perhaps you think of like what somebody might pay their landlord, right? So they, in order to stay in their home, right? So landlords, they don't do much to earn the rent that they collect from their tenants. So anytime I go and pay the rent, for example, for my apartment, my landlord didn't do that much, right, to earn that wealth. A rent is anything where money is earned without having to put much labor cost into it. Okay, so now, of course, for a country, there are various types of resources that exist where you can make a lot of money off of, but you don't have to put much labor into, right? So a rent, it's any resource that earns revenue with little work required. So, for example, oil. Right. So oil, you don't have to develop an advanced industrial economy. You don't need a large labor force. You could have a relatively small labor force. Hell, you can have foreign companies come in and pull the oil out for you. And it requires a relatively simple infrastructure. The same thing is true of mineral resources, such as diamonds, for example, gold, right? Relatively easy to pull out of the ground and export to make money off of. Now, there's also other types of rents as well, like transport rents. If you have oil pipelines running underneath your country, or if you have, for example, a canal, the Suez Canal is a great example of a transport rent. For Egypt, that's about 10% of their GDP today. So all of these you don't have to put much work into. Now, agriculture is not a rent. In contrast, if you want to develop your agricultural sector, A, you need a very large labor force. You need lots of farmers to produce food. And of course, in today's world, agriculture it really is a complex science, right? So you need access to seeds, you need access to the modern equipment such as tractors and combines. Agriculture is a science, right? And it requires a lot more investment from a country and a more complex infrastructure. And of course, industry is even more complex, right? Anything earned off industries and mass producing goods, this is not a rent. And finally, services such as the financial sector, technological development, tourism, this also requires an extensive amount of investment and resources put into it, a lot of development. In contrast, rents don't require a lot of work to be put into it. So we learned from last class, these Arab Gulf countries were some of the poorest in the world before the discovery of oil in the 1930s. And then suddenly, the monarchies of these regions, because of the discovery of oil, get very rich without having to do much work. And so, with those funds and with the help of Western oil companies, for example, ExxonMobil, they were able to help them pull the oil out of the ground. And with the revenues, they were able to increase spending to create large welfare states, to invest in public employment, build up the size of the state. They were able to build an infrastructure, roads and bridges. They were able to provide a relatively modern standard of living for their people, building hospitals and so on and so forth. And here's the thing with rentier economies. Since the Saudis, since the Sabah family in Kuwait, the Thani family in Qatar, because they have all this oil wealth, there is a lack of incentive on the part of these monarchies to invest in other areas of economic development. Why invest in an industrial sector, for example, when you could already provide a high standard of living for your citizens and you don't have to diversify the economy? If you start to industrialize, this means the economy becomes more pluralistic. That means it becomes harder to control the economy. So there's a lack of an incentive for rentier states to invest in other areas of the economy. And so what we have in the Arab Gulf is something called rentierism. This is where oil dependency makes authoritarianism more likely. Statistical studies have tended to find that there is a relationship between oil dependency and autocracy. The more oil per capita a country has, the more likely it is to be a dictatorship, right? So if your economy is very dependent on a single resource, it makes it easier for the dictatorship to really control access to resources. And what they can then do with that is buy political loyalty within the population. And since people outside the state don't control significant resources, they are out of power. And so part of what makes this possible in the Arab Gulf is just how small the populations are. So, for example, you can see on this chart that the country of Iran, Persian country in the Middle East, it has a larger population than the entire Arab Gulf combined. Right? Most of the countries in the Arab Gulf, as you can see here, are very small. So Qatar only has a couple million people, and most of those people are actually guest workers. So it's a tiny number of citizens that live in that country. Kuwait only has 4 million people. Bahrain has less than 2 million people, and so on and so forth, right? So the only country really with a significant population here is Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia has an immense amount of oil. So it's been able to sustain a relatively high standard of living. And so let's look at the GDP per capita of these countries. That is the average salary per person. So in Qatar, according to this data from 2018, the average person earns about $69,000 a year. That's more than the United States. Yet Qatar doesn't have an industrial sector. It's not mass producing goods. It's not developing new technology. It's just pulling oil and natural gas right out of the ground and sending it to other countries. So that's how it creates its wealth. The UAE has $43,000 a year, Kuwait 34,000, Bahrain 24,000, Saudi Arabia 23,000, and Oman 16,000 a year. So these countries, they are able to provide a decent standard of living for their people without having to invest in industrial development or develop the educational systems of these countries so it could produce scientists and engineers. Now, how rentierism works, and this is an important thing to understand as well about how these systems function. These monarchs don't just give out their resources equally to everybody, right? That's not how a dictatorship works in these type of systems. Instead, you distribute your resources in an uneven way. Some families get more money than others. Okay, so we could see here, for example, in the country of Qatar, we've got the Al Thani family, which has a wealth, according to these statistics, of $156 billion, so very wealthy. Then we have, as we notice here, there are some powerful families like the El Imadi family, the Al Hejri family. Notice how they also have billions of dollars. But as you notice, all of these families earn a slightly different amount of money. And so there's a high level of inequality. Now, what is the reason for this? Well, think about it. If you're a dictator, if everybody in society is making the same amount of money and they feel like they're equals, well, they're going to get along well, and they might decide to overthrow you to take over the oil wealth. So what you have to do then is if you distribute the resources unevenly, this creates competition and conflict between these different families as they struggle to get closer to the throne, as they struggle to get closer to the royal palace. So instead of banding together, they're all struggling against each other. That's what authoritarian regimes do. They pit people against each other so that they're not fighting whoever's in power, right? So you divide the resources in an uneven way. This is how patrimonialism works. So you have some very loyal family members who get more money. And what happens is, let's imagine if the king feels a family's getting a little too powerful or they're overstepping boundaries. Well, what they could do is they could take away some of their revenue and give it to someone else. Or maybe they'll throw some of the members of that family in prison to send them a message or to send other family members a message. And what you also do is you reward loyalty, right? Maybe a lower level family, if they're showing some loyalty, you reward them with more resources. So we call this patrimonialism. Now, another important aspect of these regimes as it relates to oil. So last lecture, we talked a lot about how oil has become a more important resource in the world. Well, in the 1960s and 70s, the price of oil skyrocketed, especially after the 1973 war, as oil demand grew and as Arab countries as well in the Gulf, as they began to realize oil can be used as a kind of weapon, right? So during that 1973 war, there was this use of an oil embargo where the Arab Gulf countries stopped sending oil to Western countries in opposition to U.S. support of the Israeli state during that war. Well, what happened is the price of oil went up after that. And so as the price of oil goes up and as these countries became more wealthy, suddenly their neighbors to the north started to eye them in a very envious way. And they became more and more worried about their collective security. And so thus the Saudis began to meet with the other members of the Arab Gulf in order to try to form a new organization. And eventually that organization would be called the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC. It was formed in 1981 so that these very rich monarchs, okay, could band together and defend their interests and not just, defend their oil profits, right? So we talked about how also as well we get the formation of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries that was formed in 1960. But we also get the formation of this organization to create collective security and to increase cooperation. So one of the things they started to do is they started to increase trade with each other and they created a common market. So in 2008, they eventually created total free trade. So they tore apart all tariff barriers and they began to trade freely with one another. And by 2015, they created a common currency, kind of modeled off the EU here, the European Union. So they've attempted to band together economically. And a big purpose of this is that by banding together economically, it increases cooperation, mutual trust, and from there, you can engage in collective security. And so these countries help defend themselves against common enemies. So, for example, when the country of Bahrain, this little island here in the Persian Gulf, experienced a revolution in 2011, the Saudis sent in troops to help keep the Bahraini monarchy in power. Furthermore, in 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, eventually a year later, the Gulf Cooperation Council, with the help of the United States and the UN, they were able to invade Kuwait to kick the Iraqis out. Now, of course, the US provides a lot of firepower, a lot of funding to these governments to be able to do that, right? So America has a lot of military bases in this region and wants to keep its access to much of the world's oil secure. Now, here's another aspect of these regimes that is very important to help us understand how they operate. Because they have such small populations, but they needed to build infrastructure really quickly as they were developing, they began to hire guest workers from different parts of the globe, particularly from the Islamic world. Okay, so citizens of Arab Gulf countries, okay, actually only form a minority of the working population in these countries. Now, the citizens of these countries, particularly the men, do have jobs, but usually in the public sector, okay, working for the government. So these regimes want to make sure their own citizens are controlling the states. So they do tend to work for the government, and they tend to get nice, cushy jobs with very high salaries. And they also are in charge of some of the most critical ministries, particularly the military. And usually the head officers will come from the royal family as well as close allies, the police, and the state-run oil companies, right, where they will cooperate with Western companies, right, to pull oil out of the ground. So the most important strategic sectors of the public sector directly controlled by the ruling families. However, the dirty work in the private sector, the lower level jobs, the people who actually work on the oil rigs, the people who work as domestic servants and in construction and cleaning up the streets and all the stuff that, requires a lot of hard labor, that is supplied by guest workers coming from abroad. Furthermore, the type of jobs that involve a lot of technical expertise, that require engineers, lots of the doctors, lots of the lawyers, also tend to come from other countries. So, first of all, a lot of the white collar jobs, engineers, doctors, teachers. Many of these jobs are supplied from guest workers coming from both Western countries as well as countries from East Asia. Some of this labor as well is filled from well-educated labor in other parts of the Middle East. So lots of the white-collar jobs come from those parts of the world. And we also have menial labor jobs in construction, oil drilling, working in the tourist sector and hotels. They often come from some of the more poorer countries in the world, particularly in different parts of the Islamic world, such as, for example, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Philippines. So lots of the guest workers come from these poor countries in the Islamic world here. And it's substantial, okay? A massive portion of these countries are relying on foreign guest workers to do a lot of the most difficult jobs. So, for example, in Qatar, according to these recent statistics, about 95% of the population consists of foreign workers. In Oman, it's about 80%, and same thing with Bahrain. And in Saudi Arabia, it's about 71%. Now, what does this mean? It means that most of their workers are foreign workers coming from these various countries. And, of course, these poor workers coming from some very destitute countries where the standard of living is very low, they often come to the Arab Gulf for a couple of years looking to earn a good living and then to send money back home to their family members in the form of remittances. Now, here's the thing, though. This system, especially for the menial labor workforce is highly oppressive. It's known as the kafala system. In fact, I highly recommend watching this YouTube video. It goes into the workers that built all the infrastructure for the World Cup in Qatar. These workers often come to these countries on a 2-year contract. They often get made promises by recruiters in their home country that, hey, if you come to the Arab Gulf, you earn a lot of money, you could send money back home to your family members. But oftentimes, when they get to the Arab Gulf, they get their passport confiscated. They often work under grueling conditions, sometimes working 12, 13, 14 hours a day, working in very hot conditions if they're in construction, for example. Oftentimes, their employers will abuse them physically or mentally. They will often not pay them for long periods of time, if at all. Some of these workers at all, also as well face dangerous conditions. Hundreds of people have died, for example, in the construction of the stadiums in Qatar that were built for the World Cup. And on top of that as well, a lot of these workers oftentimes, they don't have the ability to leave their jobs and find another job because the way the kafala system works, you are there on the basis that you have a job with a particular employer. So that employer basically determines whether or not you get to stay in the country or not. That gives them a lot of power over these workers. Now, there have been a lot of complaints leveled against this system by workers to the United Nations. And there's been a lot of international pressure to get these systems changed. There has been some reforms recently, but there's still a lot of problems with these workers in these countries. Now, on top of that as well, part of how they maintain control the Arab Gulf is that these workers are only there temporarily. And so there's no time to form a labor union and for worker consciousness to develop and, to mobilize against the state. So basically, the people with the toughest jobs and the lowest pay, they get cycled in and out of these countries. And they're doing a lot of that hard labor that went into building the infrastructure, as well as being the people who actually physically pull the oil out of the ground. So this is a big problem here. And of course, the Western oil companies that also make a profit off of this, they're benefiting from this system as well. So it's very controversial here and it's part of what sustains these countries. Now, so as a consequence, these systems are very authoritarian in their nature. Okay. It is the monarchs that actually rule in these countries, the ruling families that are still in charge. Now, just like other parts of the world, even for most of the world's dictatorships, the legislatures have been created, and there have been elections held for those legislators. But the reality is that parliaments in this part of the world have no real power. Okay, so while there are elections and people elect representatives, they don't actually have power. So part of the reason for this is that there are often very severe restrictions on who can vote and run for office. Oftentimes, certain types of political parties are banned. In some countries, like Saudi Arabia, political parties are not allowed at all. Oftentimes, it's only loyal members of the royal family that are actually allowed to run in these elections. Furthermore, some of these legislatures don't even create laws. They only have what's called consultative status. They can only give advice to the monarch. So they don't function like a legislature does, such as in the United States or Great Britain, where they write laws. Instead, their job is basically as a rubber stamp. They rubber stamp what the monarch wants to do. So even in cases like Kuwait, for example, where they actually do allow multiple political parties, at the end of the day, the prime minister is going to be someone who's very loyal to the monarchy. And as a consequence, there's very low voter turnout rates. These legislatures were created just as a way to kind of signal to the West that, hey, we're modernizing, we're making reforms. But at the end of the day, it's the monarchs that still rule. And there are very severe restrictions on civil liberties. These countries have very conservative laws that limit religious freedom. Many of them have very patriarchal laws that limit the rights of women, especially Saudi Arabia being a prime example of this. In fact, up until 2017, women couldn't drive in Saudi Arabia. And there are restrictions on the ability of things like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and so on and so forth. Now, with that said, despite all these restrictions, citizens rarely protest. Now, why is this the case? Well, first off, citizens have a lot of high-paying jobs in the public sector. And when you're getting paid a decent amount, there is less incentive to rebel. And on top of that, taxes are incredibly low in these countries, right? So, the reason for the US revolution, right, one of the big reasons was no taxation without representation. But if you're not being taxed, you might not care so much about representation because your standard of living is still very good. And of course, since the menial labor jobs are filled by guest workers, we don't get this kind of class consciousness here. And the few people who do speak their mind, okay, they're severely outnumbered by loyalists to the regime. And oftentimes they get thrown in prison, they get sent into exile, and in some cases, even murdered. So these are authoritarian regimes. So as you can see here, based on Freedom House scores, the GCC countries, the Arab Gulf countries, have some of the lowest Freedom House scores in the world. Okay, so they are some of the most authoritarian regimes in the world. So here, this is particularly showing this is on a scale of 1 to 7 from Freedom House. In this particular chart, the freest countries have a score of 1, the least free have a score of 7. And as you can see here, our GCC countries score 5.92. So not much in the way of freedom. Although there have been some recent reforms in countries like Kuwait, where they have been allowing more opposition to exist. Even Saudi Arabia under Mohammed ibn Salman, the crown prince, there's been a couple of reforms that have been made with women's rights, such as allowing women to drive. But overall, these are very authoritarian countries. Now, these countries as well, other than relying on their oil wealth, they also rely on their traditional legitimacy. Okay, because these were very poor countries before the 1930s. They didn't industrialize or urbanize before that. They had very traditional political cultures with traditional interpretations of Islam. So in Saudi Arabia, in a previous lecture, we talked about how Salafism, Wahhabism dominates there. And so thus, these regimes also use their religious legitimacy and their control of the media to promote the right to rule of these monarchs. And so, for example, Qatar has a state-owned media outlet called Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera has a significant amount of resources. It's a very large media outlet. In fact, they have branches spread out across the globe. In fact, their coverage of many other countries is actually quite impressive. They've got a lot of resources. But of course, this organization does not criticize the Qatari regime. You'll also notice if you go to their website, they're very obsessed with the politics of Palestine. This is something that dominates their coverage. So they tend to focus on the politics of other countries. When they do talk about, the Gulf monarchies, especially with Qatar, they tend to have positive spins, positive coverage when they're looking at the Qatari dynasty. So these countries, they also rely on, their religious legitimacy, right? So monarchies in the region, they are all Sunni Arab Muslims, each and every one of them. So the majority of these citizens are religiously conservative. And since they haven't had to really invest in industrialization, the development of new tech, right? They haven't really developed citizens within these countries, a significant number, who are going to challenge conservative religious norms. Now, of course, there are plenty of people in the Arab Gulf that have traveled abroad, gotten a great education. There have been some reforms in places like Dubai where they're starting to invest more in education. But for the most part, these societies tend to be very religiously conservative, and the majority of citizens support the implementation of a conservative form of Sharia law. And so thus we get relative social stability in these countries. So a relatively small number of people actually try to challenge these regimes as a consequence. Now, with that said, this does not mean that these places are utopias. They've got problems. All right. For one, there are some tensions over the Arab Gulf kingdom's strategic alliance with Western countries like the United States, right? So Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, while they have very conservative populations, conservative educational systems, based on, ideologies like Salafism. They also have very strong ties with the West. The United States provides a lot of the security for the Arab Gulf. And, this creates a lot of conflict and tension because a lot of conservative people in the Gulf, don't have very positive attitudes towards various aspects of Western culture, particularly things like the rights of women and the rights of the LGBTQ community. So these are very tense issues here. And so many ulama have been quite critical of the West, and of course, as well, critical of the West's political behavior in the Middle East, their invasions of countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, the presence of military bases in the Gulf. This is something that has been often condemned by these ulama. And there is also kind of fear over that, if these with this alliance, that this could lead to the spread of Western cultural influence, right? So suddenly your kids are listening to Western music. They're being influenced by a culture coming from abroad. And on top of that as well, some of the enemies of the Arab Gulf in other parts of the region have used this to their advantage to condemn the Arab Gulf states. So Iran, since 1979, a Shia Muslim theocracy, has often condemned the Saudis for their alliance with the West, calling them hypocrites, claiming that they are not acting like true Muslims by having this relationship with the United States. Now, in order to try to counteract this, these societal criticisms, the Saudis and other Arab Gulf countries do invest a lot in spreading conservative Islamic norms abroad to try to really really solidify their Islamic credentials, right? So the Saudis brag about how they rule over Mecca and Medina, the sites of holy pilgrimage. They invest a lot in mosques abroad and spreading Wahhabism abroad, so this conservative form of Islam. And yet we see this, by the way, with the polling that has been done in the past. GCC countries are the most conservative in the region in terms of their attitudes towards all these different cultural issues, such as polygamy or the right to marry multiple women. So we can see here in Lebanon, so this is a non-Arab Gulf country. It's one of the Arab republics that exist out there. Only 17% of men support polygamy. But in contrast, in Kuwait, 58% of men support it, and so this indicates that Arab Gulf countries are much more conservative. Now, just a couple of final notes here. There are some exceptions to this rule of stability in this region. And one of the big exceptions here is the Arab Gulf country of Bahrain. Now, why is it an exception? Well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, all of the other countries in the Arab Gulf have a Sunni majority population, but in Bahrain, Sunnis are in the minority. Now, the ruling family, the Khalifa family, they are Sunni, but they rule over a Shia population that is about 70% of the population. And please see a prior lecture on the difference between Sunnism and Shiism if you want to understand the differences. But what's important here is that there's a religious minority ruling over a religious majority within the population. And here's the thing, there's great political and economic divides. The military, the key ministries, the oil wealth, it is controlled by Sunni Muslims. There is a large gap in wealth between these two religious groups and a large gap in political power. And so thus, this regime relies on a lot more severe political repression. Now, you might ask, why not just distribute more resources to the Shia Muslims? Well, part of the reason is that this country doesn't have as much oil wealth as other GCC states. In fact, they've had to invest more in other industries like tourism. They're the most liberal of the six Arab Gulf countries. So, for example, they invest in tourism, and they actually allow alcohol at a lot of the hotels. So it's known as a place where people in other parts of the Arab Gulf will go to on vacation. They've got a lot of beaches. People will go there. And so thus, they don't have as much oil wealth. And there is a lot more political opposition to the regime. In fact, during the Arab Spring in 2011, it was the only country to experience a revolution, the only one with a significant uprising. And the monarchy was saved by the Saudi invasion of that country, right? So that's part of what but it's kept this regime in power. This is the exception to the rule, by the way. None of the other Arab Gulf countries experienced mass revolutions like countries like Egypt, Libya, Syria did during the Arab Spring. And this has to do with massive amounts of oil wealth and small populations. Anyway, you can see here on the map are just about all our countries in the Arab Gulf: Oman, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait. They are Sunni majority. Only Bahrain has a Shia majority. Now, one last note here. All right, so yes, these countries are highly dependent on oil. This has given them a high degree of stability recently, but, and this is the big but, oil is not a long-term dependable resource. It is non-renewable. One day, oil will disappear up from from the reserves of these countries, right? It's non-renewable. Once you burn it, it's done. It takes millions of years of biomatter compressing to create oil. So this creates a long-term challenge. It's not sustainable in the long term. Not to mention, it's as the resources start to run out, it's going to create more and more problems for the sustainability of the economies of these countries and thus their political systems. So the monarchies realize this. And what they've begun to do is they've begun to invest a lot of their oil wealth in land and businesses throughout the globe, including in other parts of the Arab world, not only to increase their political influence in those countries, but to invest. They also invest a lot of their wealth in the West, in our stock market, right? And to try to make more money off their oil. And they've created what are called sovereign wealth funds. So the hope that they'll have wealth even after the oil starts to disappear. Now, part of this as well is a rainy day fund. So just in case a lot of dictators do this, they'll put their money abroad just in case they have to flee following mass violence or a revolution. Now, part of this as well as, greater worries about, oil wealth have emerged for the future. And as they've been trying to invest more in other countries, there's been a growing competition to influence other countries throughout different parts of the world, including in the Arab world. Recently, for example, Qatar and Saudi Arabia have vied for a lot of influence in the region, and the UAE has tended to side with Saudi Arabia on a lot of the issues they differ on. Whereas Qatar has tended to support political Islamist movements like the Muslim Brotherhood that, have kind of participated in elections and sometimes even revolutions in other parts of the Middle East. The Saudis, being more politically conservative, haven't, they don't like the idea of supporting social movements, and they're also worried about issues like terrorism. They have decided not to support those type of movements. And there's been some conflict between these countries. So Qatar, for example, became a big supporter of the Arab Spring in Egypt, and they supported the Muslim Brotherhood in their efforts to run for elections in 2012. In contrast, Saudi Arabia was not in favor of this. There's a lot of conflict over this. In fact, at one point, Saudi Arabia tried to blockade Qatar and try to squeeze its economy as a way to try to stop the Qataris from doing something that went against Saudi interest. Now, what this has also led to, these dynamics, is that some of these countries as well have begun to try to invest in resources at home other than oil. So, for example, the emirate in the UAE, Dubai, has, in the last couple of decades, has begun to invest a lot in tourism, building very large new hotels, building indoor skiing rinks, artificial islands, trying to attract tourists, building new forms of transport, building airports, for example, and as well as even investing in higher education, getting universities, Ivy League universities in the West to set up a branch in their countries. So this is known as the Dubai model, right? They're trying to invest in alternatives, okay? And more recently, other countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia have begun to follow. In fact, if you watch that video I recommended, Qatar has been investing a lot in sports, right? They've been building dozens of new stadiums and sporting facilities. They attracted the World Cup and other sporting events. They tried to attract NASCAR, right? So this has been a big deal for these countries. They've also tried to attract musicians and concerts in order to up tourism. But with that said, there's been a lot of struggles with these projects because of the amount of corruption, single party rule. There's not a lot of checks and balances. A lot of the money for these projects gets wasted. And a lot of these are just glamour projects. I mean, yeah, Dubai built the world's tallest building with the Burj. It sits at over 90% empty, this massive project. So there's been a lot of corruption, a lot of poor planning, and it hasn't worked out as planned. So there's a real estate boom in Dubai, but then this led to a bust as they haven't attracted as many tourists as they were expecting with these projects. So, by the way, this is what Dubai skyline right now, and this is the Burj here, which sits mostly empty today, despite looking very impressive in terms of its size. And they built all these as well artificial islands. Once again, lots of vacancies with a lot of the real estate and hotels today. So, anyway, that does it for today's lecture on the Gulf. If you have any questions for me, feel free to leave it down in the comments. I will see you all next time.